Welcome to Green Tea with D-Man, Episode 1.5C, The New State Party Organs. Hello everyone, and welcome to the third supplement to Episode 1.5, The New State. This episode will cover the three main party institutions which were created under the new state: the National Union Political Party, the Portuguese Legion, which was an armed volunteer force commonly compared to the German Nazi SA and the Italian Black Shirts, and the two youth movements created by the Estado Novo. The National Union was established on June 30th, 1930, with then Finance Minister Antonio Salazar giving the cornerstone speech of the day. The original purpose of the party was more involved with organizing support for the dictatorship that was in power and took an all-embracing approach, that is, that there was no central ideology guiding it. All Portuguese were invited to coalesce around the regime. The priority was to ensure that all Portuguese were recognizing the nationalist spirit brewing in their nation and to work towards complete validity of the regime. Salazar especially saw the National Union as a mechanism to rally support for the new constitution, which would do away with any semblance of the First Republic whilst bolstering his position as well as that of the new state. In 1930 and 1931, the primary drivers of the party were actually Freemasons and die-hard Republicans, such as the first leader, Lopez Mateus. In order to garner support for the National Union from his traditional base of supporters, the Catholics and monarchists, Salazar told them that with no heir to Dom Manuel II, his death marked the absolute end of any hope for monarchical restoration, and thus all that was left was to support Salazar and the new state. As for his Catholic base and his former party, the CCP, Salazar suggested the Catholic Party transition into a social organization which could serve the nation whilst being absorbed by the National Union. The National Union held its first and perhaps largest National Congress on May 28, 1934, to commemorate the 8th anniversary of the coup which overthrew the First Republic. There would be few, if any, high-water marks after this. As years went by, the demographics of the party remained the same, that is, older conservative men whom relished a return to the Republic. In the 1930s, the National Union's membership rarely made up more than a third of the members of the National Assembly, Corporative Chamber, and government cabinets. It becomes clear as one looks at the National Union's trajectory from its founding in 1930 until the fall of the Estado Novo in 1974 that the party was intended to rally support for the 1933 plebiscite and then serve as the instrument with which to bind the corporative system. This trajectory was largely flat, and since the organization was legislated by the government, just as infrastructure or national defense was, it fell victim to an easy strangulation whenever Salazar and the cabinet decided to divert funds elsewhere. This is one of the instances where, perhaps, Salazar was paranoid that a charismatic upstart in favor of either Republican ideals or even foreign fascist models could have used the National Union in a bid to challenge him. As we will see in Episode 1.6, the challenges from Raul Preto and the Communists during the 1930s were dealt with swiftly once Salazar found the right leverage. Now, the National Union Party was not a political party meant to mobilize the populace towards any specific ideology, unlike the National Fascist Party in Italy or the National Socialist German Workers' Party in Germany. It did not serve a movement or ideology like the Italian NFP, German Nazi Party, or the Falangist movement in neighboring Spain. Antonio Costa Pinto remarks about the National Union. Its lethargy was especially notorious during the 1930s. Once its leaders had been appointed, its statutes established, and its candidates to the National Assembly chosen, the National Union practically disappeared. The frailty of the National Union's internal structure was also clear in the absence of departments that most other authoritarian single parties possess, notably propaganda, ideological training, and cultural intervention. It also lacked socio-professional organizations, which in neighboring Spain, for example, could be found in the FET, and the FET was the Spanish Falangist movement. By 1938, even Antonio Salazar himself admitted that the party had largely faded. During World War II, the National Union was largely dormant, but as pressure mounted after the war from the West for Salazar to liberalize the political system, he rallied the party to keep the new state in power and to prevent the communists from mobilizing as they had done across Europe with support from the Soviet Union. Once the regime maintained its grip on power, the party went dormant again until the 1960s, as pressure from all sides mounted once again, and Salazar's years became numbered. Antonio Salazar could prove to be a pragmatist when he felt heightened tension or a rising challenge, which had some popular momentum behind it. This pragmatism led to the creation of the Portuguese Legion on September 15, 1936, 1 week after a failed naval mutiny in Lisbon, one we will cover in 1.6 The Opposition, which is our next episode. Its primary mission was to eradicate communism and anarchy within the boundaries of the nation. In announcing the new Portuguese Legion, the government decree started off with the following. The population, alarmed by the dangers that have beset other peoples, wanted to take on itself a greater share of the responsibility for its own defense, by word, by example, and by deed. It went on to directly target communism itself by stating, it attempts to install itself in the social body of the nations, infiltrating schools, workshops, fields, the liberal professions, and the ranks. It denies the patria, the family, the highest sentiments of the human soul, and the secular achievement of Western civilization. After the naval mutiny and the creation of the Portuguese Legion, the government reported upwards of 20,000 volunteers. Of course, giving in to such passionate mobilization was a huge risk for Antonio Salazar, but he managed to use it to his advantage, like so many other risks he faced during his rise to, and then grip on, power. As we will hear in episode 1.6, Prime Minister Salazar still had opponents in the military, and he saw the Portuguese Legion as one more bargaining piece, or even a sacrificial pawn if it came down to the necessity of shaking off the military's threats for good. After all, while the Legion represented a type of challenge in terms of force and power, and it also shared its founding statutes with that of the National Union, the fact is that the central junta of the Legion was chosen by the government. In addition, while the movement was self-financed for the first few years of its existence, this changed by 1939, when the Legion became reliant on state funds which the government had little issue with tightening as World War II set upon the scene. The first president of the Legion's Central Junta was a former member of the National Syndicalists' Grand Council and far-right leader, João Pinto da Costa Leite. Costa Leite had strong ties with the fascists and National Syndicalists, but ultimately his loyalty would lay with Antonio Salazar, who had actually lectured a younger Costa Leite at the University of Coimbra. Many of the top officers of the Legion were also up-and-coming men involved in National Syndicalist and fascist circles, including many former members of the Blue Shirts before its banning and exile of Relao Preto. As the Falangist movement in Spain increased its influence and power under Franco during the Spanish Civil War, some of the officers in the Portuguese Legion and the Portuguese youth movement formed an agreement with the Falangists and began to challenge some of Salazar's policies. General Costa Leite had even reached out to the half-English German ambassador to Portugal, Baron Oswald von Hoon, to request details on the German SA and SS organizations. And in a bid to break the cohesion of forces aligning against him, Salazar had several top figures, including former architect of Portugal's corporatist structure, Pedro Teutonio Pereira, and the Portuguese youth leader, Nobre Guedes, sent abroad on diplomatic missions. By 1937, the Portuguese Legion had begun sending volunteers to fight in Spain on behalf of Franco's nationalists, and it was at its high tide mark when over 12,000 legionnaires and 3,000 youth members participated in a military parade to celebrate the 11th anniversary of the May 28th Revolution, which had overthrown the First Republic. Complete with newly purchased Junkers Ju-52 bombers and thousands of uniformed members giving the Roman salute and chanting the names of President Carmona and Prime Minister Salazar, it was a momentous occasion for the Portuguese nation. However, as quickly as the Legion rose, it would sink. In 1937, the government shuffled the members of the Central Junta, and while Costa Leite remained, perhaps due to his unswerving loyalty to Salazar, the general commander of the Legion, Namorado de Aguiar, who had strongly advocated for its focus to be on political indoctrination, was replaced by a more moderate commander in General Casimiro Telles. General Tellus replaced the legion's focus on political indoctrination with one on military training for eventual service if the group was needed to defend the nation. General Tellus went on to abolish the Roman salute and turned away legionnaires whose political ideology did not line up with that of the regime. Naturally, the legion was occupying a space that had long been monopolized by the army and the police, and as such, it was forced to fend for itself. Had there ever been a military coup or an upheaval in the nation, it was likely that the army and police would have worked to eliminate the legion from the get-go. Eventually, Salazar tightened the funding for the group, and he allowed it to limp along, but never able to project any real influence. It was yet another way Salazar prevented the party organs from working together, and he did this by institutional separation between the youth movement and the legion. And this brings us to the youth movements. There were a couple of attempts at organizing state youth organizations in the 1930s, but it was the Vanguard Students' Action, or AEV, and the Mocidade Portuguesa, or the Portuguese Youth Movement, which made a lasting impression. Portugal had a history of youth organizations which trained for eventual service to the nation. Even during the Republic years, there was a nation-at-arms principle, which saw the organization known as the Preparatory Military Training, involving Portuguese youth, but the general mobilization of youth never fully took root, even under the Estado Novo. During the rising popularity of Preto and his blue shirts, Antonio Salazar reluctantly agreed to the establishment of the Vanguard Students' Action in the early 1930s, as a way to take some of the wind out of the sails of the blue shirts and to take the ball out of their court by creating a space for fanatical supporters of the regime to organize. Just like the Legion, though, this organization was directly under the control of the government itself and not the National Union or Portuguese Legion. Despite a mass amount of support to the regime, the AEV was allowed to be starved of funds. Under 3 successive ministers of public instruction, the roadmap for the Portuguese youth was ironed out until finally in May 1936, our old friend from episode 1.3 and fellow accused monarchist, Carneiro Pacheco, unveiled the new movement. Just a month prior, in April 1936, Pacheco had transformed his ministry into the Ministry of National Education and had defined the new movement as a national and pre-military organization designed to stimulate the integral development, the formation of character, and the devotion to the patria's defense. Just as with the Portuguese Legion, the rising threat of communism ushered in mass support for the Portuguese youth in order to prevent the spread and indoctrination of communism from its adherents and Soviet agents on the Iberian Peninsula. Now, I've noticed that over half of the original volunteers into the Mocidades recruitment centers were actually above the legal age limit as established by the law. As with other party organs in the Estado Novo, the Portuguese youth was also placed into the bottom of the pile in terms of funding. The government had other initiatives to focus on, and Salazar felt little concern for the constant letters begging for funds from the commissioners in the Legion and the youth movement. Another thing here is that, like we've mentioned before, Salazar was much different than the other leaders in Europe during this time. Where Hitler and Mussolini loved theatrics and dramatic scenes of national emotion along with mass rallies and speeches, Salazar was the opposite. Antonio was shy. He felt that dramatic speeches and mass rallies did more harm than good, and he believed that the job of governing the nation should be a simple affair, not overshadowed by unnecessary expenditures on huge rallies and shows of force. It's also key to remember that Portugal was still a very rural nation that was just entering a sense of political modernity, which most of Europe, especially the major powers, had already undergone. In addition, due to the nature of the monarchical system that had been in place in the majority of the populace was detached from the political system. Just imagine a population the complete opposite of the way we are here in the US in regards to politics, and that is what Portugal was during the 1930s. It was such a way that Salazar wanted the population to be so the technocratic elites could properly run the country without passionate and misguided interference from groups whipping the populace into a mass frenzy. Anyways, back to the Mocidade. While the organization was given its own uniform, flag, anthem, and a national structure which included a national commissioner who reported directly to the Minister of National Education, the movement actually had to fight for influence with the Catholic Church. Even with the Portuguese youth incorporating a girls' movement in 1937, it wasn't able to break the church's monopoly on scouting, and by 1939 actually found itself forced to having a director of moral formation imposed upon it, with said director being a priest of the Catholic Church. In 1944, the second national commissioner of the Mocidad, and the eventual successor to Salazar, Marcelo Caetano, attempted to convince Prime Minister Salazar to finally commit the Portuguese youth movement to an institutionalized and well-funded organization which would provide the regime a pool of future elites who had dedicated themselves to public service within the Estado Novo structure. By this time, Antonio Salazar had many concerns, as the Axis powers fell and the Allies were looking to pressure Portugal into liberalizing. As such, he refused to commit extra funds and instead promoted Caetano to the Minister of the Colonies. From this point on, the Mocidad, just as the Legion, was all but starved of funds and allowed to wither. And with that, we will conclude this third supplement to episode 1.5, The New State. Next time, we will jump into the three primary centers of opposition to the Estado Novo during the 1930s. That is the conservative Republicans, the Communists, and the National Syndicalists. I'd originally planned to include another supplement to this part, which would cover the intelligence and security apparatus of the Estado Novo, but since we will cover the opposition groups and dissidents in our next episode, I'll instead add a supplemental episode 1.6a, so make sure you stay tuned in the coming weeks. I will leave you today with a provocative fact. The regime of Antonio Salazar was responsible for less deaths of political opponents from 1932 to 1968 than the U.S. government was in the Waco siege of 1993. Until next time, this is Green Tea with D-Man.